Welcome! In this lecture, we're going to talk about the version of Unreal that we're going to use, as well as the text editor that we're going to use, and finally, we're going to create a new project. Let's begin. Okay, so I'm going to be using version 5.2.1. Make sure you have the same version as me installed. Otherwise, I cannot guarantee that you're going to have the same experience. Things are different across different versions. For the most part, you should be fine even if you're using version 5.1 or 5.0. 95% of the time you should be fine, but it's that 5% of the time that things might be different. So in order to have the smoothest experience, make sure you have the same version as the one I have here, which is 5.2.1. And I'm going to assume that you have Unreal installed and you know how to install it, because this is a intermediate/advanced beginners course. So a lot of the basics I'm just going to assume that you know. That being said, I will explain everything that I'm doing in this course in great detail. It's just the basics that I'm not going to explain. For example, if we are programming and I'm creating a new variable in C++, I'm not going to explain what a variable is. So that type of stuff and like the basics of the editor and how to use it, I'm not going to touch on. If you don't know the basics, take a look at one of our beginners courses here on Game Dev TV. We have some excellent ones that take you from an absolute beginner to an intermediate user of Unreal. So make sure to give those a look if you don't feel confident with the basics. So that's just a heads up for you. Okay, so that's the version of Unreal that we're going to use. The next topic is the text editor. I'm going to be using Visual Studio 2022. On Windows, you can also use Visual Studio Code. If you're using Mac, you can also use Xcode as well as Visual Studio Code. It doesn't matter which one you use. There is absolutely zero difference for you if you were to use Visual Studio Code or Xcode or Visual Studio while you follow along. You're not going to have a different experience. It all comes down to personal preference. So pick the one that you like the most or the one that you're comfortable with. And like I said, it's not going to matter, and I'm going to use Visual Studio. Okay, so with those out of the way, let's go ahead and create a new project. I'm going to launch the engine from here. Okay, so here we are in the project browser. From here, we're going to pick the third person template because the game that we're going to make ultimately is going to be using the third person camera view and a third person controller. So this is the one that we're going to pick. We're going to set the project defaults to be C++ instead of Blueprint, and everything else here we can just leave as is. Finally, we're going to rename the project. I'm just going to call it Multiplayer Course, but feel free to use a different name. And for the project location, I have a dedicated folder for all my Unreal projects, and this is the path. And we're going to create this project. Okay, so the project creation is finally complete, and here we have the third person template demo level essentially. And we can play this, and you will see that it looks like a single player game with this demo level and the third person character that Unreal gives us. But actually, this demo will work with multiplayer. We can actually, in Unreal, in Engine right now, test this game with multiple players. And that has to do with how networking is implemented in Unreal Engine. In Unreal, networking is very tightly integrated into the engine. Basically, all games made with Unreal are networked and are essentially multiplayer games. The single player ones just don't let anyone else connect to them. So because networking is so tightly integrated with Unreal, we actually get a lot of functionality out of the box without actually doing any work. Now I'm just going to show you how we can play this game with multiple instances on the same machine in the editor here. Okay, so here in the toolbar up here, we have a menu with these three dots. If you click on that, you'll get this pop-up menu. And down here we have some options called multiplayer options. Now I'm going to play with these and not explain them, but I'm just doing this to give you a taste of what's about to come. I'm going to explain all the things that I'm doing here in great detail in an upcoming lecture. So don't worry if you don't understand what I'm talking about right now or doing. So just keep that in mind and don't worry. Okay, so here we can set number of players, which sounds exactly like what it does. It increases or decreases the number of players that we test with. So let's set this to be 2. And under the number of players we have net mode. And this one is currently by default set to be standalone. You can think of standalone as a single player game. We want to make this a multiplayer game. So we're going to switch this to be a listen server. And let's click on this. And that will make one of our instances of the game to be a server, and the other one will be the client, which is the one that connects to the server. Again, I'm going to explain these more, so let's just go ahead and see what this looks like. So with these changes, I'm going to run the game. And this time you can see that we have an extra window that popped up. This is that client I was talking about. If you actually expand this and take a look at the toolbar here, you can see that it says client 1. So this is the client, and the one that we have running in the editor, that's the server. I can pick the client and start moving, and you can see that the character on the server is also being updated. So we basically have multiplayer functionality out of the box. We can switch to the server and move here as well, and those changes will also apply to the client. So why does this work? The reason it works is that the player controller, the movement components that Unreal gave us, have network implemented. So out of the box, without doing any extra work, they just work correctly in multiplayer. Now we're currently testing in the same machine and not across the internet, but even if we did that, these would still work. But that being said, not all things are like that. For example, let's see. Let's try pushing this box. And you can see that I pushed the box, but in the client, let me get my mouse back by pressing Shift plus F1, and that will give me my mouse back. You can see that on the client, the box landed on the slope, but on the server, it landed here. So that's not consistent between the server and the client, which isn't correct multiplayer functionality. The characters worked because those were implemented to work with multiplayer games by Unreal. But the cube didn't work, the box didn't work. For the most part, we're gonna have to handle things to work with multiplayer. And the term here that you should learn would be replication. The character controller is replicated, but that cube or the box isn't. Okay, so enough with that. I'm gonna close this instance, and if you close one of them, it will close all of them. So these controls that we have here, the number of players and the net mode, these give us a convenient way of testing multiplayer games using a single computer. If we didn't have these, we would have to package the game and send it to a different computer. You can imagine that that would be very, cumbersome and inefficient. With these settings, we can, test the game real fast, and it makes things really easy for us. Okay, so that's going to be it for this lecture. In this one, we first talked about the version of Unreal that we're going to use and the text editor. And after that, we created a new project and did a little demo of the different multiplayer testing features of Unreal Engine and talked about the third-person character being replicated by default and other things that aren't, and those things that we're gonna have to do on our own. Thank you for watching this lecture. I'll see you in the next one.